Today, on Brasher Warning.
This is where things get really tough. They ran into a significant tailwind at the LZ, stronger than they had anticipated.
How strong are we talking?
17 to 20 knots. That exceeded both their planned conditions and the aircraft limitations. And to add to that, their deceleration maneuver, which is where they transition from airplane mode to helicopter mode for landing, was started late and was very rapid.
Welcome to Brasher Warning, the podcast that dives deep into aviation incidents with sharp analysis, insightful discussions, and just a touch of edge. If you're passionate about aviation and love a good post-incident breakdown, you're in the right place. Before we take off, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share with your crew. Let's get into it.
Today we're diving into a tragic event, the CV-22B Osprey crash in Afghanistan. We're going to be using the official accident investigation report to try and understand how this happened and hopefully learn from it.
These reports are amazing. They really go deep. They don't just cover what caused the crash. They look at everything, like the mission itself, the crew's experience, even the weather conditions that night.
So let's start with the mission itself. What was the CV-22B doing out there that night?
It was a routine infiltration mission, inserting special operations forces into a landing zone. But there was a lot of pressure involved. The squadron was on alert posture, which meant a shortened timeline for planning the mission.
So they were working under a tight deadline. What did that mean for their preparation?
Basically, the briefing focused on two key things: picking the landing zone and the illumination plan, which was especially tricky because of the low moonlight.
So visibility was already a concern. What about the crew? How experienced were they?
This was a highly experienced crew. The pilot was an instructor pilot with a ton of flight hours. The flight engineer was an evaluator. And even the co-pilot, although new to the CV-22, had a lot of experience. The tail spanner even had recent combat experience on the MH-53.
So we're not talking about rookies here. Okay, so they take off. What happens next? Anything unusual happen during the flight to the LZ?
Well, the flight path took them from the main operating base to a forward operating base to pick up the team, and then finally to the infiltration LZ. What's interesting is they flew slower than their planned cruise speed for the first 10 minutes of the flight.
Any idea why?
The aircraft had just had new avionics software installed, which actually increased the maximum speed, so it's possible the crew is still getting used to those changes.
Makes sense. So a new element thrown in right before this already high-pressure mission? What happened after that?
They transitioned to low-level flight, relying on their terrain following radar. That system helps them navigate at low altitude, especially in low visibility conditions.
So crucial for a nighttime infiltration mission.
Absolutely. But here's where another wrinkle comes in. The co-pilot reported seeing a second illumination beam near the LZ that wasn't supposed to be there.
Oh, that's not good. All right, let's talk about the approach to the LZ. Things start to go wrong here, right?
Right. This is where things get really tough. They ran into a significant tailwind at the LZ, stronger than they had anticipated.
How strong are we talking?
17 to 20 knots. That exceeded both their planned conditions and the aircraft limitations. And to add to that, their deceleration maneuver, which is where they transition from airplane mode to helicopter mode for landing, was started late and was very rapid.
Could that delayed maneuver have been a factor in the crash?
It's definitely possible. That late and rapid deceleration, combined with the unexpected tailwind, put a lot of pressure on the pilot. He had to deal with this while also managing communications and flying in low visibility.
Sounds like a lot to handle all at once.
Exactly. It's what we call task saturation. Basically, the pilot's mental capacity was overwhelmed by all the demands of that situation, like trying to juggle too many things at once, and some inevitably fall.
It's easy to see how that could lead to critical errors. Did the crew realize how serious the situation was becoming?
There's evidence they were starting to understand the problem. For one, their speed was way too fast for the approach profile they were supposed to be flying. At the 1 nautical mile point, they were going twice as fast as they should have been.
And at half a mile.
More than twice as fast.
Wow. Anything else?
There's also video footage that shows some kind of substance trailing from the aircraft in the last 20 seconds before the crash.
What could that have been?
It's not certain, but it could have been fuel mist or even smoke, which might indicate there was a problem with the engines. And on top of all that, the cockpit voice recordings capture a very tense discussion in those final moments, almost a rapid countdown.
It sounds like they knew they were in trouble and were trying to regain control.
That's certainly the impression you get from the recording. They knew something was seriously wrong, but they just ran out of time.
What can you tell me about the impact itself? How did the crash happen?
The Osprey hit the ground about a quarter mile short of the LZ, And despite everything that was going on, the initial touchdown was actually quite smooth, like a rolling landing.
That suggests the pilot was still in control, even at the very last second.
It really does. But unfortunately, the story doesn't end there.
So what happened after the initial touchdown?
The aircraft hit a drainage ditch, which caused the nose gear to collapse, and that triggered a disastrous chain reaction. The Osprey flipped, tail over nose, and broke apart. The left wing even caught fire. It was a devastating scene. Sadly, 4 people were killed: the pilot, the flight engineer, and 2 of the passengers. So we were talking about task saturation and other human factors. There's another concept that might have played a role here. It's called negative transfer.
Negative transfer, what's that?
It's when your previous training or experience actually works against you in a new situation. Like your old habits get in the way of adapting to something new.
So you're saying, in this case, maybe the pilot reverted back to the way he used to fly the Osprey before the software update, even though he had trained on the new system.
Exactly. Under that kind of pressure, your instincts take over.
Mhm.
So even though he had simulator training on the new software, in that critical moment, he might have instinctively gone back to the old control inputs, and that could explain why the aircraft was going so much faster than it should have been.
Wow, that's a scary thought, that your training could actually betray you like that. It makes you wonder how you can design training to prevent that.
Yeah, it's a real challenge for sure, especially when you're dealing with these really complex systems. Speaking of challenges, we're also talking about the co-pilot and how he got distracted by that second illumination beam.
Right, that really stood out to me. It's such a small detail, but it could have had a huge impact.
Well, think about it. He sees this unexpected light right when they're entering the most critical phase of the flight. His attention is pulled away from his primary duties. He's no longer fully focused on assisting the pilot with the approach.
So instead of helping manage the situation, he's trying to figure out what this unexpected light is all about.
Right, and we can't know for sure what impact that had, but we do know that effective crew coordination is absolutely essential in aviation, especially in this kind of high-stress situation. So any disruption to that coordination can be really dangerous.
It's like a chain reaction, you know. One small thing goes wrong, and it sets off a whole cascade of problems. And speaking of things going wrong, we haven't really talked about the possibility of engine problems yet. Was there any evidence of that?
That's one of the big unknowns in this case, unfortunately. The flight data recorder was never recovered, so we don't have that detailed information about the engine's performance in those final moments.
So it was a missing piece of the puzzle.
It is. We do have some witness reports that mentioned hearing engine-related warnings, and there's some evidence of abnormal engine activity leading up to the crash.
But without the flight data recorder, it's impossible to say for sure whether engine trouble contributed to the crash.
That's right. We just don't have enough information to make a definitive conclusion on that. But this brings up another interesting point from the report. It has to do with how the Special Operations Forces team was seated in the aircraft.
Oh, right. They weren't in the regular seats, were they?
No, they were sitting on the floor, secured by harnesses.
I remember reading about that.
All their gear and weapons wouldn't fit in the standard seats, so they had this special floor-mounted harness system. But the problem is, that system wasn't designed to withstand the forces of a crash like the regular seats were.
So the regular seats would have offered more protection.
Potentially, yes. And this highlights a real dilemma in military aviation. You want to be flexible and accommodate the needs of these specialized missions, but you also have to prioritize safety. And sometimes finding that balance is incredibly difficult.
It's a tough call. So I guess the question becomes, is there a way to improve that seating arrangement to make it safer without sacrificing the operational flexibility?
Exactly. And the report actually suggests that this is an area that needs more research and development. Can we design a system that provides both the flexibility and the safety? That's the challenge.
A challenge with potentially life-saving consequences. So we've talked about some of the challenges, but let's talk about the investigation itself for a moment. What kind of obstacles did the investigators face in trying to figure out what happened?
Well, the missing flight data recorder was a huge setback, obviously. But despite that, they did an incredibly thorough job. They examined every piece of the wreckage, they pored over the maintenance records, they interviewed everyone who might have had relevant information, and they even ran simulations to try to reconstruct the events leading up to the crash.
So they really threw everything they had at it. And what did they ultimately conclude? What were the main takeaways from the investigation, aside from the specific contributing factors we've already discussed?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that aviation accidents are rarely simple. They're usually the result of a complex interplay of factors. It's not just one thing that goes wrong, it's a series of events, each one influencing the next.
Like a chain reaction, but with multiple chains all tangled together.
That's a good way to put it. And that makes prevention really challenging. You can't just focus on one thing. You have to be thinking about the whole system, all the potential points of failure, and how they might interact.
So what does that mean in practical terms? What kind of lessons can we draw from this accident in terms of training, procedures, technology, all of that?
Well, I think it reinforces the need for really comprehensive weather planning, especially in military operations where you're often dealing with challenging conditions. You can't just rely on general forecasts. You need detailed, specific information about the conditions at the LZ.
And we know that the crew in this case was operating under a compressed timeline, which might have affected their weather analysis. So how do we make sure that doesn't happen again?
Well, part of it is about training, making sure crews understand the importance of thorough weather planning and how to balance that with the need for speed in these time-sensitive situations.
So it's about skills and judgment, not just following a checklist.
Exactly. But it's also about creating a culture within the organization that prioritizes safety even when there's pressure to get things done quickly.
So a culture where people feel comfortable raising concerns and double-checking information, even if it means slowing things down a bit.
Right, because sometimes slowing down is the fastest way to get where you need to go safely. And another big lesson, going back to that negative transfer issue, is the importance of really robust simulator training, especially when you're introducing new systems or updates to existing aircraft.
So in this case, making sure the pilots had enough practice on the simulator to really internalize those new control inputs so that it becomes second nature, even under pressure.
Exactly. This crash is a tragic reminder that aviation safety is an ongoing process. It's not something you ever achieve, it's something you constantly strive for.
And sometimes, even with the best training and technology, things can still go wrong. And that brings us back to the human cost of this accident. We talked about how the pilot managed to execute a smooth landing despite everything that was happening. It really speaks to his skill and training.
It does. Even in the face of a rapidly unfolding crisis, he was still fighting for control, still trying to save the aircraft and the people on board. It's a testament to his dedication and professionalism.
And it's important to acknowledge that even as we analyze the mistakes that were made, these are real people, highly skilled professionals who were doing their best in a very difficult situation.
Absolutely.
We've spent this deep dive really digging into the details of this CV-22B Osprey crash, the mission, the crew's actions, all the factors that contributed to it. But as we wrap up, it's important to zoom out a bit. What are the big lessons here? What can we learn about aviation safety in general?
I think this accident really drives home the need for constant learning and adaptation in aviation. You can't just rely on past experience or assume new technology will always work perfectly.
Like we talked about with the pilot possibly experiencing that negative transfer, even with simulator training, those old habits can come back under pressure. So how do we design training programs that can really address that human factor?
We need to anticipate those potential challenges and build more resilience into our training. Simulators, for example, need to be as realistic as possible, not just in terms of how the aircraft flies, but also the environment and the stress levels pilots experience in real-world scenarios.
So they can practice making decisions under pressure. What about the organizational culture surrounding safety? The report mentioned that as a factor too.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just have good training and procedures. You need a culture that truly prioritizes safety. It has to be okay for anyone to raise concerns without fear of repercussions. And thoroughness has to be valued, even when time is tight.
So a culture that encourages speaking up and double-checking things. Sounds simple, but potentially life-saving. You know, another thing that really stood out to me was the weather planning aspect. They relied on general data and missed that crucial information about the tailwind at the LZ. How can we prevent that kind of oversight from happening again?
Redundancy is key. Weather briefings should always include very specific forecasts for the exact landing zone, and crews should be trained to recognize and respond to changing weather conditions on the fly. And we can use technology to our advantage here too, giving pilots real-time weather updates throughout the mission.
So it's about using all the tools at our disposal to mitigate risk.
We also discussed the Special Operations Force's seating arrangements and how that created a tough choice between flexibility and crashworthiness. Are there any solutions on the horizon for that?
I think this is a great opportunity for innovation. Maybe we can come up with new harness designs or seating configurations that provide both the flexibility those special ops teams need and better protection in a crash.
Striking that balance is so important. So beyond specific recommendations, what kind of lasting impact do you think this accident has had on the aviation community as a whole?
This tragedy serves as a powerful reminder that aviation safety is a continuous process, a journey, not a destination. We can never let our guard down. We have to keep learning from past incidents and always be looking for ways to improve. Because it's not just about preventing one specific type of accident from happening again.
Right. It's about understanding that accidents are rarely simple. Like we saw in this case, it was a combination of factors, human actions, environmental challenges, technological limitations, all coming together.
And recognizing that human element, even in these highly sophisticated systems, we can improve training, refine procedures, develop new technologies, but at the end of the day, human decisions are still a critical part of the equation. And on that note, as we close out this deep dive, I think it's important to remember the human cost of this accident. 4 lives were lost, and their sacrifice underscores the importance of the work we do in aviation safety.
Absolutely. We owe it to them and to all those who fly to keep learning, to keep pushing for improvements, and to never forget the lessons of this tragedy.
This deep dive has been a sobering but necessary look at a tragic event. We hope it's encouraged you to think about the complexities of aviation safety and the constant need for vigilance and improvement.
Let's remember those we lost and honor their service by continuing to strive for a safer, more resilient aviation future.
Thanks for tuning in to Brasher Warning. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you never miss a flight with us. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment or review, and don't forget to share the podcast with your fellow aviation enthusiasts. Until next time, stay sharp, stay safe, and keep soaring.
American 1552, contact center 127.0.
1552, we're going to be Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. We have an engine failure. We're going to return to DFW.
1552, roger. And which runway do you need?
We'll take 18 right.
Roger, American 1552, turn right heading 020, descend and maintain 8,000.